feel positive, but just keeping in mind that I'm not going to feel this way forever, whatever my personal feeling is. And focus on those little practical things. The navigating U.S. healthcare is difficult at the best of times. It gets worse when you're having to deal with everything without that going on. So try and get as much as you can done. That's very good advice. And if you need to take some time, there's nothing wrong with that either. I do know that anyone that's been through it, it's almost always turned out to be positive. However, these things have turned out, right? It's led to a career change for me that I'm absolutely loved.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome, everyone, to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today is my co-host and our Director of Research, Cliff Stevenson. Cliff, welcome to the show today. We're kind of recording in kind of the break between the holiday knot here in the United States around July 4th. We've got some not so good news this week, but we've got a lot of good news. So it's an interesting week for news in the HR technology space. What are all the things we're going to be talking about today, Cliff?
Yeah, as you mentioned, as we were talking about before we started recording, that there's definitely some negative news, and not just that it's July 4th for our English listeners who may not still approve of our leaving the colonies, but there is some negative stuff. But as I started to really compile it and think about it, there's still a lot of positive movement. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about some acquisitions and some mergers, including companies like Bullhorn, Phenom, Monster, and CareerBuilder. That'll be an exciting one. We'll talk about some increased funding, proving that it's not all dark clouds, right? We've got Phenom and TechWolf, a new CEO at PlanSource. And then we will have to mention some things that actually one of the things that happened that we wanted to make sure we had for this recording, the layoffs that happened at UKG and some major decisions in the United States Supreme Court that could have long-lasting effects in the compliance and regulatory landscape for work. So
yeah, it's been I think we tend to think of the summer, as we've been heading into it, as a quieter time in the HR tech space. Outside the US, it's definitely what we call holiday season, or people getting ready to go into holiday season. But I think what's happened here is there was so much, people kind of put things on pause, and there was a lot of waiting because of the AI conversation, because of what's happening around the world globally, both in economic and socioeconomic and sociopolitical issues. So we've really been in this sort of weird sort of in-between space in the HR space. We talked a little bit about it at the last HR Tech conference. I think we're going to see more of it here, right? So one of the things that I think we're gonna have a lot of conversation about today is how to keep moving forward in the midst of this constant change. So we'll have a little bit of guidance on that. We've got some tools we're putting out here at Sapient Insights just to help some of our customers and clients. Also today, just a reminder, I think by the time this comes out, if you get a chance to listen to it when it first comes out, we'll also still have the opportunity to sign up for a few events that we'll be doing. One is the PlanSource webinar. That's going to be on July 16th, and on engaging and empowering employees with data and insights primarily around what's happening in the benefit space. So if you want to sort of understand HR tech and benefits and how those two things are merging and how they're helping give employees more insight and data to help them feel more in control, that's going to be the conversation. And we have some news from PlanSource this week, so we'll add that to that. So if you need to sign up for that, look at our newsletter. If you haven't seen it recently, there was a link to that there, or go to the PlanSource website, and I think they have a sign-up registration as well. Also going on in the next couple of weeks, so we'll be doing a roundtable the week of July 22nd. It's an invitation-only Chief HR Officer and CEO roundtable focused on, interestingly enough, this topic we just talked about, which is change and how organizations are handling change and how they're handling in a way that supports their diverse workforces. That's going to be at Pendo's global headquarters, on Wednesday, July 24th at 8:30. If you're interested in participating, you're local to the Raleigh, Cary, North Carolina space, which is where I live. Let us know. We're happy to bring you in and be part of that roundtable conversation. We're excited about where that's going. We are also, just for everyone who maybe didn't get the chance to do it, we've closed the survey. Sorry, Cliff. I know there's a few people at the last minute going, oh, wait, one more week. At this point, it is completely closed. Tammy is analyzing and cleaning and making sure that we have everything put to bed. But if you didn't get a chance to participate, that doesn't mean you won't have access to the research. It does mean you might have to pay a little bit for the research. So, or you might want to attend some of the events that we'll be doing. One of the ways that you can catch it is by going to the signing up and participating in the HR Technology Conference. If you're interested in special code, we've got that to give you 150 off that HR Technology Conference at the Las Vegas in September. I'll be giving our big Voice of the Customer, the first look at the data research session there at 1:00 on the first day of the HR Technology Conference on Wednesday. That'll be myself. We also have Terry Zipper, who will be doing a panel with a good friend of ours from another organization, Dina Bishan, at the Women in HR Tech, which is on Tuesday, the day before the opening session of HR Technology Conference. And we will be doing several sessions at the IREM booth and a couple other events. So you and I will be doing podcasts throughout the HR Technology Conference. So there's going to be a lot of places to get a chance to connect up with us and meet with us and ask any questions you have about the research. Or also watch out throughout July. We're going to be putting in some special early bird buying details about how to get access to the report if you didn't get a chance to participate as well. So be sure to download our newsletter. So Cliff, that was a lot of things that we're doing this week, but I know you have some exciting news. You were really happy about where we ended with the research this year, right?
Yeah, I was just about to say, that's why I'm not going to be too upset. Like it's over, because although we won't know the exact numbers because of the cleaning that our team's doing, as you mentioned, we can confidently say it's going to be our largest survey ever in terms of the number of respondents that we got from it. So thank you all. There's a very good chance if you're listening to this, you took the survey. Thank you for that. We know that it's long, and we make a lot of efforts into making sure that it's, although comprehensive, it still has ease of use. We think about these things, we don't just talk about them, we put them into place. And I think that along with just all the great efforts we had from our distribution partners, and of course all of you that would have taken it, this is going to be the biggest year ever, which allows us to, we have insightful data, but as an organization that prides ourselves and defines ourselves by our data, the more that we have from more different places and more different industries just means we can be that much more confident and give you even deeper insights into not just what's happening overall, but what's happening within maybe just your hyper-focused region and industry. And nothing makes me happier than that. So,
yeah, I will say I was a little, because I thought the 25th anniversary would be our biggest year. Because you're always, whenever you've been doing this, you're like, oh, we'll that this will be it. And then after this, it'll be great just to hit 2,500 every year, right? I think, last year we got a little bit more, and I was like, oh, wow, that's great. In a fluke, there's a lot going on. People are trying to figure out. I think this year definitely blew me away. And we even had some switch up in some of our big distributors, right? Mm-hmm. Some of them had to drop out, some had to move around. It was a little bit interesting. So that means that we're going to have, I think, just some really powerful data this fall. One of the things I think we're going to be talking a lot about will be, where is the HR technology buyer's mind? What are they worried about? And it is AI, but there's a lot more than that going on in their mind. So Cliff, one of the things we wanted to sort of get into today is talking about where some of the investment monies and the mergers acquisitions happening in the space, and how that's going to be sort of playing out in the same sense as the person who's actually, from a buyer perspective, making decisions in the market. Like, how are those two things going to be sort of colliding? What's happening from the big investors, the people who are sort of making those decisions on the stock market level, and the buyers who have to make decisions every day about which solutions they're buying? Maybe where do you want to start today with all of that?
Well, let's talk about some of that. Let's talk about the AI, because I do think that is part of the conversation, and that's motivating sellers as well as buyers, right? The classic sort of marketplace, right? Trying to anticipate what people are looking for, right? Because if it's not on the shelves and people can't get to it, right? And for that reason, I think Bullhorn acquired Textkernel specifically because of their AI solutions, right? So this is Bullhorn. If you're not in recruiting, you may not know as well, but for those of us like me that came from the RPO world and the recruiting world, talent acquisition, very well known. It is software that's used primarily in specific industries and for specific purposes. A lot of it in the sort of recruiting and staffing, right? So those are in those, those high number, high volume areas of things like healthcare, light industry, professional services. And Textkernel was the software layer that laid underneath a whole lot of big staffing agencies and a lot of the Fortune 500 companies. So Bullhorn is being very future focused here and saying, that you can take some time to develop AI, or you can see what's working now and what is already in use in their specific group and world that they deal with. And I think that motivated a lot of getting after this sort of AI, because as we're going to talk about later, you're going to need solutions to underpin and find the right people and talent that are out there. And this is a part of that.
Yeah, Textkernel was, I think, one of the larger, parsing technologies, right, in the space. We say parsing, it's parsing resumes if you're not in the talent acquisition space on a regular basis. That doesn't sound all that important, but it's actually one of the most critical things if you're in the talent acquisition space, because resumes get uploaded and you're always trying to figure out how to kind of take that data and turn it into something that's valuable. And they had recently connected what they were doing with OpenAI's ChatGPT. I think part of this is that, we're seeing AI say that, hey, we can do this and I don't need to have any specialized tools. I think what we're seeing here is that, yes, there's still context that needs to be driven. And there was a lot of context built into what Textkernel's done, right, over the many, many years that it's been working. Plus, there was a lot of bias management introduced into what they were doing and a lot of focus on, I think, really understanding the nuances of a resume. One of the things that a good friend of ours, Brian Summers, has been talking about is sort of the challenges you're seeing with any of the artificial intelligence from the person who's actually putting forth their resume into the system, right? So like how are employees, how are candidates basically figuring out how to game the AI environment. One of them is things like, white labeling a little bit of information inside of your resume so that the parser will see that, like make sure that I show up in the environment, right? That stuff we've talked about already, but I think this is an opportunity where you can really kind of connect those dots and maybe address some of those changes as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you're dealing at scale, right? We often talk about sort of the benefits of AI and of these tools isn't so much the generative side, which makes most of the headlines, but the ability to automate at massive scales. And staffing agencies deal with that and say, we need to quickly find these people. And a simple search engine isn't going to cut it when you're trying to find a certain combination of skills or use terms, or if you want to be able to sort of compile that and get, like you said, remove any sort of biases and say, who are the top 10, windshield developers and, terms like that can have different meanings, but will be known to a more advanced system.
I want to know what job you were in as windshield developers. I'm telling you, I love it.
Yeah, software, often you get these terms like Python and windshield or even engineer. There we go. This can have very different meanings depending on your industry, right? So Who knows? Another acquisition, Phenom, I always think of them as Phenom people because I'm way too old, but it's just Phenom, acquires a company that I'm going to do my best. It's TYDY. I went with Tydy. Stacey, your best guess?
I did tie-dye. I'm not sure if that's correct, though. So, yeah,
well, we don't know.
Seen this particular company.
Feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to know. But they're, doing the pre-boarding and onboarding work. So really trying to keep that, the term that's often used is seamless, but it really is. It has to do with the experience, but also the data transfer through that whole effort. So although it wasn't planned this way, it is pretty interesting to think that of the technologies that are used all the way through, very early in an employee life cycle, long before you're an employee, right? Just getting the information, compiling it, and allowing someone to hire you, and then what happens next, right? So that's where these now just one company, but where these companies work, which is making those connections so that once you're in the system, everything comes through, and that's the idea, right? To create that unified experience and to make sure that the data transfers.
And I think this adds to Phenom's goal to become more of a platform and not just a tool. It's very similar to what we saw with Greenhouse picking up an onboarding solution and then building out onboarding in their environment. We saw iCIMS do something similarly, really building out their onboarding and pre-hiring. I think for Phenom, which has a little bit more of a talent intelligence play along with what they're doing on the other recruiting areas and talent pools, this really helps, I think, with sort of that platform conversation. So I'm interested to see where they take this. We haven't got an update on this, but I think it'll be one step closer to sort of their broader vision, right?
Absolutely. And I think in general, as you said, trying to create that, one source. And it's also, as we said, that idea of keeping that data, which will be important for regulatory environments as well. And we'll talk about that in some pretty big news later on. But so we've talked about a couple acquisitions. We also saw a merger, a combination, if you will, because this is happening at the shareholder level. It isn't a sort of classic where one company takes the other, but it's more controlling interest. And these are names that if you spent some time, even not just in the recruiting world, but ever trying to get a job and you're of, I wouldn't even say a certain age, pretty much everyone up until the youngest of our listeners will know Monster and CareerBuilder. So they have combined with, and now help, Stacey, I know we worked with this, so let me know if I get this wrong. Monster, which their controlling group was Randstad or Ronstad, if you want to get very Dutch about it, they had the controlling interest on Monster. And now, I think I've already got it wrong. And then
I think you already got it wrong, yeah.
And CareerBuilder,
CareerBuilder.
Yes, will have the controlling interest over the shares that previously were held by Ronstad.
Yeah. So this one, again, controlling interest, what we are seeing is Randstad is sort of exiting out. They had sort of picked up the CareerBuilder environment and really tried to sort of grow that into something broader. I don't know that they've sort of given up completely on that model, but I do think what we are seeing in the market here is that what was or used to be the big role of the job boards, which these used to be major companies, like the biggest in the world, right? Monster had how many Super Bowls ago, I think was the comment I saw on LinkedIn a couple times, right? Since Monster was the name to know. We've seen them change hands a couple of times. Monster was picked up by a big firm separately. A CareerBuilder now is sort of, again, moving over to be merged with them. What they're finding, I think, in all cases, is that these job boards need to be consolidated. They need to be at much larger levels. I think someone said that they're still about 5% of the overall market. But our data shows, obviously, that Indeed is probably the largest in our data set, and I think in the market. Indeed was still in the top 5 user experience and vendor sat scores for SMB organizations. So from their perspective, as a recruiting solution, they feel that Indeed's doing that job. We saw ZipRecruiter also coming up in that space.
The other one, yeah.
Right. So some of this is that they're sort of being new technology, new options have sort of outpaced them. Some of this is just that, we saw this market start to change as organizations and candidates stopped sort of going directly to the job boards and started using aggregators and tools that were sort of pulling and aggregating this information together. And this is sort of one spectrum together. We were talking about Phenom just a moment ago, and now we're talking about Monster and CareerBuilder. And really, this is sort of the end of the road that many of us saw 5-6 years ago. We started to see the idea that people were sort of pulling data automatically from these job boards to show in different places. And this is really going to lead into the generative AI conversation over time, because to combine and to basically deal with the fact that someone is pulling your data and maybe showing it someplace else, you've got to have a big enough organization and a big enough legal group to be able to battle that IP issue, right? And you've got to be able to sort of have enough data to make it valuable for these large language models to actually broker a deal with you versus just taking what you have that's open on the web. This was the same conversation we had about Microsoft LinkedIn several years ago. And so what's happening is these organizations are all going to have to sort of morph into something that's going to have a much stronger standing and have more valuable data sets, because much of the talent intelligence platforms are using, if not data from the job boards, they're also using data from the employer sites for job profiles. And eventually that stuff's going to start to get locked down. And then you're going to have to really think about, how am I going to train these large language models going forward if I can't get that data openly from the internet? And this is really the conversation the buyers have to think about. Every time they talk to a talent intelligence platform that's talking about how they're bringing you taxonomies, bringing you data about job roles, bringing you information externally, you have to ask the question, where's your data coming from? What's your strategy for making sure that data is always accessible. And how do I know that where that data is being managed and cleaned and effectively overseen, right?
Yeah, that amazing point. And the only thing I'll add two things to it. First of all, when doing the research on this, I found out that 30 years old Monster when it first started. So 94, 95. But it also reminded me of something you said very early on when you were talking about, we had seen in our data that, these weren't the big names anymore. And it wasn't really until I started having a chance to be able to, be in this world, this data immersed world, kind of going back to comments early on, of saying, here are the big players, and they may not be who you expect. And I think it really does show the value of, these large data sets that we have, not to toot our own horn, but, any data set, any of the inferior ones too, you're welcome to look at. But, you could see and say, what if I wanted to see it, but just for small businesses? Is this really who the top are anymore? Just the ones that I know? That's, of course, as you said, Super Bowl ads, right? That's what gets the name out. But who are the big players anymore? So that's kind of interesting, too, to think about how you're supposed to understand who's out there and what your resources are. But everything you said is spot on, and it is following the arc of how a lot of the data is kind of gone, as we've talked about in AI before, that it only makes sense for it to go in this sort of direction.
Yeah,
for good or for worse.
Yeah, and I think it is behooves all of us to sort of think about, where is the candidates, where are the buyers, where are the people who are inputting this data, where do they feel the most comfortable sharing their data? That has to be a question you've got to ask, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. So as long as we're talking about, we didn't go very long, I want to say, in this episode without mentioning AI. I think we hit it right off the bat, and we've got more. Fairnow, who I believe we mentioned almost a year ago or so, just got $3.5 million in seed funding. And what they are is AI governance software. So, Stacey, exactly the kind of point you were making. There is now a market for that. AI has become such a ubiquitous part of work that now there's software to help govern, the data within your AI software, right? So, already we're seeing an economy built around this technology rather than just being, this is something new. It's really been an amazing amount of growth. So, helping organizations, that's, sort of Fairnow's mission here, to, help them get control of where data is stored, how it's being accessed, how it's being used, so sort of that alignment and keeping that sort of central repository. And clearly enough people see the value in this that they're, improving their seed funding throughout. So
yeah,
really,
this was exciting to see, right? Like, because we had just covered them not too long ago. We've had a lot of conversations with Richard Rosenau on this one and other people analytics. David Green and I had talked a little bit about this when I was up in Europe last year and in Barcelona at the Workday event. These are whether it's going to be a tool like this or the next generation of this tool. I think the more we think about our tools and our technology and our data, the more we have to think about the tools that are going to manage them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, proof of that, the next kind of big news was TechWolf also receiving funding. This was a much larger amount, $42.75 million in Series B. And this is another AI company, Belgian. This has been a very low countries focused, Netherlands and now Belgian episode. But this is AI, but specifically within the skills organization. In fact, part of this funding, I don't know if it was the majority, I think you have a little more insight here, Stacey, was from Workday Ventures. And I believe you had a chance to talk to them some about that. Is that correct?
Well, I talked about a month ago with the TechWolf VP of Marketing and VP of Product, Yasmina Karamin and Vicky Holdsworth. So Yasmina Karamin is, first of all, she's amazing in how she's thinking about this product, right? And I think one of the things to know about TechWolf is that it has been sort of, I want to say this carefully, it's been the darling, but it has been the darling of many of, I would say, some of the long-standing industry voices in this market. It is similar in sort of what it offers from a skills management perspective to some of the other solutions that have been picked up recently, like the Sky Hive acquisition that was made by Cornerstone, just recently the Hired Scored application that was made by Workday. It has a talent intelligence component to it. they have a couple of different offerings that they do, including sort of they do some of this talent intelligence data gathering from external sources. Now, one of the things nice about them is they're very clear. This is one of the conversations that Yasmin and I had was, how were they gathering their data? And it was very clear that they had a strategy around that went beyond just some of the traditional scraping that happens in the market. They also do a lot of internal assessment of your data, and they have the perspective that they can build an AI-driven taxonomy. Now, if you've seen some of our research, we're finding that AI-driven taxonomies need to be adaptable and editable, and that's some of the conversation that we had because your company has to influence some of that conversation. But there is this question as to whether you have a taxonomy versus an ontology. But AI is definitely part of what's running this artificial intelligence. AI is definitely what's running the skills management area. And it is, I think, the only thing that's going to make it more feasible. So I think a lot of the reason why TechWolf is getting so much attention is, one, it's got a lot of really good people sort of leading and guiding and advising them. Two is that I do think that, they've leaned in heavily to the artificial intelligence conversation because they know how important that is to doing skills management at a scalable, renewable level. Now, what's I think sort of interesting here, though, is that the other thing to be aware of with TechWolf is that it is, yes, it had some Workday as part of the innovation piece, but we also saw that Arcadian Ventures, which is backed by Jason Corsello and Thomas Otter, who are well known in our industry as thought leaders and also people who and plus there are a lot of other people who are part of that fund. They have a lot of other solutions in that fund as well. They're also partners in that. We also saw a lot of other organizations like ServiceNow Ventures in that, Stride VC, Notion Capital. I mean, they had a huge group of sort of a wide range of organizations who have invested in that, meaning that people believe that this company has maybe some longevity and they want to understand how it's working and maybe create stronger partnerships with them, which is a really good sign for them. The one caveat I would add to all of this is that there was a little bit of a tiff up online when this first went out. And so I don't want to take anything away from this great funding and the work this organization has done as a really strong portion of what's happening in the skills management space. So if you're looking for skills management solution, TechWolf should definitely be on your list. But I thought this is just interesting to just make a comment for any organization that's going out and making announcements about themselves and where they're at and what they're doing. So a little tip off on LinkedIn when they posted the picture of them getting the funding. The group was heavily sort of male oriented, not a huge deal. I think there's 5 women compared to 20 or 25 on the screen or something like that. And there was a comment made by one of our previous colleagues who I love dearly, who basically said, just the optics of this is, could you have made this a little bit more of a balanced picture? We know how many women are working and supporting and a big part of what's going on at TechWolf. And there was a little pushback on that. Like, is this really the conversation we'd be having here? The only thing I would say on this is I think, one, you do have to think about optics. I always tell vendors when they're demoing to me, when they're giving me, presentations, when they're showing anything about who they are as an organization, just make sure you have really thought through the diversity of just even the people you're showing who are in your organization and the distribution of the roles within your organization. You cannot be talking about an organization that's really supporting HR if you haven't really thought about your own diversity. Now, that's not to say that TechWolf hasn't. I think TechWolf has done a good job based off of the data they've shared about the percentage of females and people of color who are working within their organization. But I do think that you have to think about this, and this gets back to this representation conversation. I know this because I have conversations with a lot of young women, and I have conversations with a lot of people who are coming up through the market, and they say, look, when I see someone who looks like me in a space, I feel more comfortable stepping into that space. And that's, I think, the message all that our colleague was trying to share there. But I think it's an important one for all the vendors to note, right? So just a little side note on that, because it was a big conversation online.
No, that's wonderful. And I think that really gets to the heart of the title, right? Spilling the tea on HR tech, or even getting into some of the, I wouldn't call it, it's certainly not gossip, but it's extremely important. And yeah, and I think also just kind of talking about an interesting sort of connection between these stories has been a few years ago. There was a lot of talk, amongst, people like you that kind of know the space and could kind of prognosticate what was going to happen of this move from a sort of jobs-based to skills-based for hiring. And what do we see? We see a consolidation from the job boards and, kind of less traffic there and a lot more funding going into how do we use AI to find and make the most use of our skills, either in the organization or to find them. So really interesting to see how that is played out, kind of correctly predicted. While at the same time, within the world of AI, that who could have predicted that it would be so a big a part? We all knew it was coming, but to have come this fast. So
yeah, I think how fast it's come is what I think we were all seeing. And I think part of the reason it didn't, part of the conversation in the market that we've got to understand about why maybe it didn't come as quickly as it could have is there were a lot of people who were holding back the work because they knew that the technology wasn't quite ready for prime time, that it was still doing things that could give us the wrong information, and it acted like it was the right information. And I think even in ChatGPT and even in what we're seeing with Gemini and some of the other tools, they know it's still learning. I think there's two differing opinions, right? We get it out there and it will get better because it will be learning off of real life conversations happening, and when it's wrong, they will be told that it's wrong. Or do we wait until it's really ready for people to use it appropriately? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that is a true ongoing conversation in our industry, right? About is the public a great place to train AI? And I think we're finding out. I think it is kind of just because you have the power, should you use it, right? Is that conversation?
Well, let's keep going with that thought because that leads into it, and we'll circle back because I did have one little bit of news. But I like this idea because Microsoft put out a study, the title being AI at Work is Here, Now Comes the Hard Part. And they had a lot of stats. Now, keep in mind, this is their own study. And certainly they have a vested interest. I don't think they would deny that. And they were very transparent about their methodology and even about some of the issues. But some of the stats are that AI is kind of just being used, and so that, we need to just, adapt around that fact where they said 75% of knowledge workers use AI at work today, and 46% of users started using it less than 6 months ago, meaning there's been just a huge jump in the last 6 months. And with the primary idea of using it to save time. But all of these were, 90% said save time, and even enjoy their work more was still pretty high at 83%. So, they also talked about the use of their own tools, right? That, how it's being used for meeting summarization and email summarization. Not a big surprise there. But it kind of gets into that, right? That there's a narrative that certainly they would like to push and may also still be true, that it's already happened, that there was a bit of hold because maybe the software isn't where it's supposed to be, but yet here we are using it anyway. And it's been interesting to note, although this, it's very positive and I don't think too unexpected. Also, we'll have to see our own numbers because they're going to be a little more broad in scope in who we're gathering our information from. But I'm guarantee you it'll be more than we saw last year. I don't think it'll be as high as 75% of knowledge workers using AI, unless we broadly define what AI is, right? So,
yeah. AI at this point is anytime you do a search or hit the summarize button that someone has put out there, right? So I think I'm not surprised by that number. I think when I sent it to you, I said sending plus suspect, see who wrote it and who put it out, right?
Yeah.
Not to say, Microsoft has more data than anybody about what people are doing, right? Like that is part of the gist of what, as we buy Microsoft these days, part of what we're sort of signing up for is that they're kind of watching what's happening in the background. And yes, you and we talked about this. I use it almost every, not daily maybe, but definitely every couple days, right? It's helping write abstracts. It's helping us do some data and cleaning carefully. We've been very, very careful. We're going to have some updates for everyone on sort of what we're using it on and how we're managing it. Again, very carefully with nobody's information anywhere near anything that could be outside for training. We're using it in a lot of places to just help us gather data, and then we have to go through a validation process with all that data, right? Like that's a thing that happens in the market a lot. So I think some of it comes down to how you're using it. But I also think that, so much of this world that we're in thinks really heavily about knowledge workers. Mm-hmm. And I think the next conversation has to be about, is AI going to be, doing some of the heavy lifting when it comes to areas that's not just sitting in front of a computer. That's the opportunity, I think. I think there was that meme that's been coming out, right? Like, it's great that AI is coming out. I wanted it to help me, do my dishes and cleaning so I could do more creative poetry, whatever, and writing, and not do my poetry and print, right? So I could do more dishes and cleaning, right? Big proponent of that, get that, right? And I think that is really where we're going to have to start to really look at, like, can we take this technology and use it in a way to balance the workloads, to balance the environments a little bit better? And so I think that's going to be some of the conversation. And I think part of it's going to be who's leading these organizations and what they're doing and how they're approaching it, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I think very specifically, we met with Harry, the company, last week, and a lot of their industries they deal with are in hospitality. And so, when they were talking about AI, all they were saying is that, we can use this to help optimize scheduling, right? Because if you've ever worked in that industry as a manager, you're even as a worker trying to avoid, closes followed by openings, or, even if it's just people you prefer to work with, and, and managers have to deal with these headaches. But when you can go in, put in preferences as, one of those people taking the shift, and the system can go through and optimize the schedule, give you a chance to say, take a look at this and do it in a natural language way. You can just go, I don't want any shifts on Friday. And you could even just say it by voice and then see that sort of thing. Those are where I think people would like to see more of AI, right? Instead of the poetry. And those sort of applications, I think, are sadly, as you said, left out of that conversation. So,
and I think that gets right to our next. I think the last article before we sort of dive into some of the issues to this week that are not as happy, let's put it that way, right? Is we do have a really good announcement. PlanSource appointed Mike Morini as Chief Executive Officer. And I think this is a really good example of a place. PlanSource does a lot more than most people realize, because they're private labeled under a lot of solutions, the benefits management for a lot of organizations. And they're really powerful solutions for managing that. They're one of the many that show up in our research, or along with a lot of others who do it, right? But for a while, I think they've been trying to find the right leader in the organization. Their CEO had stepped down. They had a lot of really great, strong leaders who were in different roles in the organization, but they hadn't found a new chief executive officer. And they just put in place Mike Morini. Now, Cliff, you said you've known Mike. You met him at Workforce Software, right?
Yeah, I know him from his work at Workforce Software. We don't ride jet skis on the weekends or anything, but I've known him from his time there. And in his time there, he's been very successful. He's very... he's a good personable leader. He has to oversee basically people that help very complex organizations. So he himself has to sort of, understand all that to be able to help develop his organizations that can handle those sort of things. Companies are going through massive, mergers and acquisitions and have lots of employees in lots of different spaces. So yeah, he understands these idea of these regulations and these complex environments, and can help build the software that can manage those sort of things. So really a great pick, I think.
Well, and on top of the fact that, so I had a chance about 2 months ago now to actually meet with them and sit through their customer advisory board session and deliver session to some of their customers there.
At PlanSource?
At PlanSource, yeah, yes. Thank you. And Srini Venkataraman, and I don't know if I'm going to say his last name correct, so I apologize, Srini, but he's their Chief Product and Technology Officer, and he really impressed me with his thoughtful approach to thinking about how do you make the benefits management world more engaging and really importantly, not just engaging in the sense of, it's prettier, it's easier to pick things, but more useful for the customer, which is the employee, right? Like, this is the space where the employees there's so much impact. Anybody who's dealt with any healthcare issues here, particularly in the United States, but even internationally, where you have a lot of sort of options when it comes to what you can or can't do, even if you have government funded healthcare. This is a place where I think AI could really offer a benefit to the whole market if it's used effectively. And to your point, I think Mike is a great choice to do that. I think Srini has already done a lot of work on the product itself. I think it'll be great to see them sort of figure out what their channel model is, what their sales model is, how they're going to roll some of this work out. His team has really, I think, been thoughtful about AI. And so I'm interested in seeing where this goes. So I think it'll be a great opportunity to see a solution that oftentimes you don't hear about, because it's not, sometimes benefits is sort of that afterthought, but anybody who works in HR knows it is really important to get the relationship you have with your benefit solution right.
Yeah,
So
and you said you're going to have the webinar coming up, and of course, we'll be open enrollment. It's going to speed up. It's going to catch up to you. As someone who's had to live in that world, it seems like it's far off, but it's really not. It's just a few
it's
months.
not, yeah.
So yeah, the one of the main reasons why you won't notice it, listener or viewer, but we wanted to delay because some big news came in. UKG, who I'm sure you know, that was the company that was formed from the Ultimate and Kronos merger. They just laid off over 2,000 people worldwide. It's around 14% of the workforce. I don't think it's specialized in one particular area. You know, they've got major offices in Weston from the Ultimate and then Lowell, Mass from Kronos, but it is kind of across the board on the types of jobs and is part of a larger restructuring that they're trying to do, a streamlining. You know, we were talking about streamlining companies, and sometimes that's positive, right? You're adding things in, and sometimes it's very negative. And I know, Stacey, both you and I know people personally that have worked there. I've been working with some of my friends from my old RPO days to try and help them connect. But, it is, I wish we could only ever talk about mergers, acquisitions, and increases, but that will, everything coming out, it's not going to affect any users of their software. Nothing's being shut down. They're not shuttering any modules or divisions or anything that would have an impact on what you're seeing out there. But it's still, I think, is reflective of what is still, although, is a growth market, there is still some volatility as we've seen in the general economy.
Yeah, and this one, I think it's depending on sort of where you look and the different voices you're getting on this. There's a couple of things to note on this. One is that UKG and what was Ultimate and Kronos completed their merger right before the 2020 sort of shutdown in the market, right? So a lot of people might remember that. And at that time, usually when you do a merger and acquisition, not too long after you go through a pretty big sort of analysis of your workforce, redundant workers, and all those things. Aaron, who at that point in time was their CEO, had kind of said that we kind of put some of that on hold, and we feel like there's enough sort of ability to be able to sort of move people around to not have to do some of that big sort of redundant work shifting. I don't know if some of this came out of the fact that they kind of put some of that on hold, and now Chris Todd, who's the new CEO, had to sort of address some of that. I do think that some of this is, they did do sort of in March, about 260 job reductions. I know they were doing some losses through just pure attrition, but if you look at the overall numbers of what UKG has been bringing over the last several months, and particularly the last year, this is not a reduction because UKG itself was doing poorly as an overall organization. And I think that's something that it's really hard. It's much harder to have that conversation. And we've seen it happen multiple times in the last couple of months. This was the same conversation Accenture had when they laid off about 18,000 not too long ago, as they were going through sort of that AI analysis of their work effort road. It was the same conversation we saw in a couple of the other large tech firms who had overhired in some cases, right, during the 2022 fear of not having the right roles, not having the right skill sets inside the organization. I don't know all the reasons. We'll get some more data, and we'll definitely be sharing that when we're able to share that around what was driving UKG's decision to sort of do this big of a cut and at this point in time. What I can say is that this market it particularly hits hard because we know so much more, I think, as HR professionals about, one, how this impacts the people who are going through the process. We also know how it impacts the people who are left in an organization and their sort of personal sort of feeling about an organization. And so it's hard for all of us to kind of wrap our arms around this. The one thing we have a good friend, Sarah White, who put out, if you looked up her posting, put a list, and she's starting to sort of try and connect different people with different organizations that might have job openings. My one advice, though, to anybody out there who's listening, who is going through this, because I've gone through multiple layoffs in my life. Once when I was in my 30s, once when I was in my 20s, and then once just recently in my 40s. Each time I had to make a lot of decisions. And each time it was because the organization was making big changes and we were part of sort of much larger groups, right, that were being let go. But that does not discount, even though it's not personal, that you don't get angry, you don't have fear, you don't have anxiety, sometimes relief, sometimes just sheer overwhelm. Take the time to feel the emotions, take the time to give yourself a breather. That's what many of the packages are for. Really give yourself a moment. Don't let your emotions make your decisions for you. my first layoff when I went through it, if I would have taken the first job offer I got, I would not be where I'm at today because I was, very afraid because I was the primary breadwinner in my family. And so just my, thoughts go out to everybody who's dealing with this, but I just want to give you that sort of semblance that we're all here and we'll be here after you get a moment to breathe. So when you get a moment to breathe, we're all here to help. And then also too, for those in the United States who are impacted, this has a big impact on your healthcare. The only other advice I always tell people who are going through this, schedule all of your healthcare stuff immediately, get that off your plate. That gives you a little bit more breathing room. So my two big words of advice, because I've been through this. Cliff, I think you've been through it as well, right?
Oh yeah, anytime there seems like a general recession, working in recruiting is not the place to have been. And very similar to what you were saying, I think that those thoughts of how you feel today is not how you're going to feel always. And because it can seem like platitudes, right? Because everyone's going to be out there, and there's nothing wrong with that. I never begrudged anyone trying to give me, just making me feel positive, but just keeping in mind that I'm not going to feel this way forever, whatever my personal feeling is. And focus on those little practical things. The navigating U.S. healthcare is difficult at the best of times. It gets worse when you're having to deal with everything without that going on. So try and get as much as you can done. That's very good advice. And if you need to take some time, there's nothing wrong with that either. I do know that anyone that's been through it, it's almost always turned out to be positive. However, these things have turned out, right? It's led to a career change for me that I'm absolutely loved. But that doesn't do you much good when you're in the thick of it. But it's a good thing to remember that, your today is not the rest of your life.
And I think, that kind of leads to some of the other stuff that we're going to be talking a little bit more about over the next couple of months, right?
Actually, you're going to be talking about it because this is a family-friendly podcast, and I've got no family-friendly words about this. The Supreme Court overturned they're calling it the Chevron decision. Most people refer to it as the Chevron deference. Basically, this was a ruling, over 40 years old, basically saying that when it comes to regulatory, judgments, right, there's a piece of law, something is enacted that has to do with compliance and regulatory things, regardless of that could be anything from the workplace to fisheries, which is actually how this got overturned. If there was some contention, that was handled by the regulatory, and they would help interpret what that meant. When there's new things that come out on the internet, for instance, and the FCC would say, okay, well, this is how we should interpret that. This gets rid of that. Now all of those decisions go to the court. So immediately we saw a lot of companies file things. In fact, a few ones were overturning any sort of LGBTQ protections and removing those because they are no longer going to be held onto by any regulatory group. I saw they'll be charging more, most likely for any sort of Medicare or healthcare because of regulations saying how much you could charge on those sort of things. That will no longer be decided by those agencies. So it would go to a court. I'm not going to say any more words about that. So, Stacey?
Yeah, I think the big thing here for our audience who are thinking about this from an HR tech perspective is I don't think anything's going to happen today or tomorrow. This will be down the road that this is going to have an impact on you. But it may have some impacts as some regulations get sort of challenged in the courts, particularly EEOC regulations, some of the labor law regulations. My recommendation to everybody, one, is stay very close to your vendors on any regulatory things if things are changing. Two, get a good labor law professional who you can connect with, even if you're a small business and you don't sort of regularly sort of deal with some of this stuff. Have somebody that that you can sort of go to and depend on just for those questions. One of the things that we have that in our data this year is that, and it's shown it for a couple of years for small businesses, is that trying to do HR by yourself is scary and hard. And we find time and time again that those who have an advisor or consultant we don't do any employment law advice on our side, but those people end up being seen as more strategic because they're not trying to sort of manage this alone. I think we have a couple of good people who can, if not be your help, maybe guide you to some of the right people. Heather Busing, who's a good friend of ours, is a great place to go for information. There's a couple of other people that we'll put in the posting as well. Just find the right person to sort of be your guide on this one. The other thing too is I think this is we've been going through a big amount of change over pay transparency. And this may be one of the areas that gets a bit of the early pushback in some of these areas, right? Which could actually cause us more of a challenge in HR than not, because we've already put in place so much around this. So one of the things I recommend, speaking of Heather, and I don't think we talked about this, Cliff, but Heather just put out a book in conjunction with salary.com, I should say, over there, but it's called Get Pay Right, How to Achieve Pay Equity That Works. So just a shout out to Heather and Cliff. We'll put the link for everybody down in the notes, because I think she's talking a lot in there, from what I can see, about pay equity and the compliance around it. Not just, there's a lot to sort of make decisions about what's right and how to morally sort of handle this and how to think about this ethically for your organization. But there are just some guidelines and regulations, and I think sort of being in front of that will be important as we go through some of these conversations. So yeah, it's a rough couple of days. We've been thinking a little bit about, sort of the market we're in is volatile. It's not in a bad or good. Change is something that we are facing on a more constant basis than we've ever had. We've been saying that for years. It's not like it's something new. Here's what I would say is, in your organization, when you're dealing with all of these things for your employees, really try and decide how much change your employees can handle and how much change you as an organization can handle. The most important thing is to not let change roll over you, but to basically lead through the change. And that's probably the best advice we can give on all of this. Even in your own personal life, when you're dealing with some of the stuff that we talked about earlier with the UKG changes, it is so easy to let other people sort of set the tone for where you're heading, and to let fear drive some of the decisions that you're making. And I get it, because I've been there many times in my life. Change leadership is about really figuring out how you can comfortably and with, I think, authentically say, here's how I'm going to manage the change and how I'm going to address it and handle it. And so if that's anything we can sort of give everyone with a kind of an ending wrap up. And I know we've gone long today by far, Cliff. So
I think we're just going to say that this is the regular length now, because I think it's really important to, I think you did a wonderful job, not just saying what was happening, but, giving not even just their interpretation, but maybe some advice on how everything ties together. So I really thank you for that. I'm inspired. We don't always know everyone. We don't have this scripted out. I think it's pretty obvious sometimes. So thank you for that. For those of you watching on YouTube, I'll hold up my 2 dogs at the end, so for some positivity.
Just to give us some smiles. Well, let's close on that note. My kitty cat is downstairs trying to stay away from the heat in my office right now, here in our 100-degree weather. But as we wrap today, just a couple of big reminders, right? Just if you have any questions, anything that comes up in the conversation, feel free to reach out to me and Cliff. We love to hear from you guys. I won't go into all the other things to remind you of. I think we did a lot of that at the beginning of the session today. Just if there's something that we would help to talk about, or if you have some feedback for something we've said, please let us know. We want to make sure that we address it and have those conversations here online as much as we can. Also, just a big thank you out to the production team who helps us put all this together. We know a lot of times we're getting this in at the last minute. So a big thank you to Brand Method Media Groups and our producer of the podcast, run by founder Kelly. If you haven't seen her work, she does amazing work on the marketing side. Go take a look at her organization and the work that she's doing. Also, to our marketing team, Lisa Renko and Summer Orlano, we wouldn't be able to do our jobs without them. Particularly, so much effort goes in from Summer to keep everything straight for us, and Lisa, and making sure that the newsletters are up to date with all the information. So thank you to both of them. Thank you to our listeners and our community. We're all here together. We couldn't do this without you. We are here after everybody gets through everything that you've been going through this week with the holiday, this week with sort of the news. Let us know if there's anything we can do to help. And that's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it's been just the brew you need to start the engines running this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR tech updates and insights, and maybe some more pictures of some cute dogs from
There we go. Say goodbye, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.